How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, let's start with the fact that you've managed to capture the imaginations of a lot of different people in California. And I'm curious about, let's start with an easy one. What would your first 90 days look like if you prevail?
Well, I think the pressing problems facing California have to do with the rising crime, the rising homelessness, the way the state was shut down in ways that I feel were inconsistent with science. And so I'm going to do something about those things right away. Regarding crime, I think the important thing is to change the rhetoric. I think one of the reasons we're having rising crime is because the police are falsely accused of engaging in systemic racism against Blacks, that they're using disproportionately deadly force against Blacks just because they're Black. There's a long article in the Washington Post on April 27 of 2016 that looked at research going back over decades that show, if anything, the police are more reluctant, more hesitant to pull the trigger on a Black suspect than on a white suspect. What it's done, however, is caused the police to, as Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago said, to quote, go fetal, close quote, meaning they're engaging in passive policing as opposed to proactive policing. Bad guys know it, crime goes up. The other thing that happens with this false narrative is that young Black men believe it, and they're therefore a lot less likely to comply. Many of these high-profile deaths and shootings could have been avoided if the suspect had simply complied. So I'm going to change the rhetoric about how bad the cops are. 81% of Black people want the manpower of the police to remain the same or to even be increased. And the late Tupac Shakur once even said, we need the police more than anybody else because of the crime in our neighborhoods. We also have,
Mr. Shakur died several decades ago. Sorry to interrupt, but let's focus on what you would do. Would you replace the entire cabinet?
I just said what I would do, and the main thing I would do, if you don't like my answer, we can move on to something else, but the main thing I would do is to change the rhetoric. The police are not enemies. The police need to be defended. They need to be defended rhetorically. 81% of Black people believe the police manpower should remain the same, if not be increased. The defund the police movement has hurt. Barbara Boxer just got mugged in Oakland a few days ago. And a few days before that, the Oakland PD complained about money being moved out of his police department for other purposes. Here in LA, we've had an increase in shootings, an increase in homicides, and $150 million from the police department has been moved for social programs. Social programs, which by the way, wouldn't be necessary if it weren't for the fact that the left has, in my opinion, over the last several decades, hurt the nuclear intact family through the welfare state that was launched in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson. I know it's a long answer to your question, but I also believe we have soft on crime DAs in San Francisco and in Los Angeles. This whole idea of cashless bail, releasing people without fear that they have to go back to jail if they haven't paid their bail, has also caused an increase in crime. Also during the pandemic, 20,000 prisoners have been released early under some sort of compassionate release program because of coronavirus. Many of them, according to stats, are going to reoffend. And according to the Associated Press, something like over 70,000 felons are subject for early release over the next coming months and coming years. I would reverse those policies.
Mr. Elder, I began by noting that you have tapped into what I think is a real vein of discontent. Acknowledging that, that's why we're honored to have your time here. But I want to go into the specifics because I think part of what you need to try to do, if I'm not mistaken, is convince people that you could govern. And that's why I'm asking, how would you work with a legislature that has a Democratic supermajority? How would you work with the existing regulators, department heads, and administrators? What would you do with the boards and commissions? In other words, we know what Larry Elder's messages are. What would his administration look like? Or do, rather?
Well, regarding the disdain comment that you made, it seems to me pretty mutual. One of your board members is Gene Guerrero, who all but called me a Black David Duke, but we get back to that. What I'm going to do is to use my power and my authority to do a number of things. One of which is to let the Democrats know, as I was speaking with the former governor, Pete Wilson, he advised me, let the Democrats know that if you don't get buy-in from the Republicans when you get there, you're going to veto legislation. And he said, once you do that and let the Democrats know if they don't listen to some of the ideas from the Republicans and you're threatening to veto legislation, all of a sudden the legislation gets a lot more sane. There hasn't been a veto overridden in California. I think it was since the late 70s, early 80s. Believe it or not, a lot of bills have been vetoed by outgoing Governor Jerry Brown and by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Not a single one was overridden. Turns out you veto a bill, you explain to Californians why it was vetoed, and lo and behold, the legislatures do not override that veto. I also have the ability to declare a statewide emergency. I think there's a statewide emergency on water. I think there's a statewide emergency on homelessness. As you pointed out, I also have the ability to appoint heads of the commissioners. And some of these commissions are very, very powerful, like the Coastal Commission, like the Public Utility Commission. I also have a line item veto, and I have, again, the ability to have the bully pulpit, all of which I intend to use when I get up there in dealing with the hostile legislature.
Let me ask one more question before I switch to my colleagues. You know, Mr. Elder, this editorial board actually endorsed Pete Wilson's reelection in 1994 and Arnold Schwarzenegger's reelection in 2006. Now, I would say a lot of things in California seem to have changed since 94 and 06. The state has become more liberal. There's been virtual one-party domination since over the last decade. And a lot of the positions that you've outlined during your campaign, including on abortion rights, including on social policy and the welfare state, as you put it, including on everything from smoking to climate change to COVID-19, seem to be at odds with, you know, the liberal direction this state has taken. How would you've shown that you can galvanize people who already agree with you. How would you actually reach out to those who do not?
Only some of the things you just now mentioned have anything to do with this recall election. The only one that really does is COVID, and I don't believe I'm out of step with the Californians on COVID. I think most people, the primary reason that this man is being recalled is because of the hypocritical way he proposed mandates while at the French Laundry, sitting there with the very people who helped draft those mandates, not wearing masks and not engaging in social distancing. I think that his kids who enjoyed in-person private education while shutting down in-person schooling for Californians really, really angered a lot of people. If you look at the polls, inner city Black and brown parents support choice in school. The teachers union, the largest funder of Gavin Newsom, does not support choice in school. 75% of Black boys, this is pre-COVID, could not read at state levels of proficiency, and they're not very high. And nearly half of all third graders cannot read at state levels of proficiency, and those levels are not very high. There was just an article in the LA Daily News that said 2/3 of Black parents do not want to send their kids back to Los Angeles Unified in the fall, in part because they feel that they get the worst teachers, and I would add the worst principals and the worst administrators. They're not sending them to the West Side. They're not sending them to the Valley. They often end up in areas of South Central Los Angeles. And so I believe that I'm going to be able to not only galvanize people on the right, but also independents and Democrats who want choice in education. I can't think of anything more important than making sure that your kids get a competent high school education, one where when the kids do graduate, they can read, write, and compute at grade level. The first step towards leaving poverty is to finish high school, according to a study by the Brookings Institution. So for all those reasons, I believe that I'm going to be able to galvanize Californians, whether they're Democrats, whether they're independents, and whether they're Republicans.
Mr. Elder, thank you. Well, one of the issues we have not yet discussed is homelessness and the affordable housing crisis.
Right.
So I am going to turn to my colleague, Carla Hall, who covers these issues for us and has some questions for you.
Hi, Mr. Elder. You said that you'd have the ability to declare a statewide emergency on homelessness. What do you see yourself doing to try and reduce homelessness across the state?
Well, this is an involved answer. Obviously, if it were easy to solve, it would be solved. But one of the problems is we don't have low-cost housing here in Los Angeles. And one of the reasons for that is because of the California Environmental Quality Act. A contractor after contractor, developer after developer have told me that they often had projects 20 years ago. They were cut down to 1,000, cut down to 500, cut down to 200 because of the fear of lawsuits by people who are using that environmental law to stop almost any kind of construction. The average price of a home in California is now $800,000. That's 150% more than the average price of a home in America. And Leo Hanian, the brilliant economist for UCLA, who often writes about real estate issues, says that the average price of a home in California is 50% more than it would be but for the environmental laws that drive up the price of housing. So I'm going to declare a public emergency on homelessness so that I can unleash the hundreds of thousands of projects that are on the boards, all ready to go. They're being held up because of lawsuits. This is a state where for the very first time, we're having a net migration out of California. And these are people making between 50 and 100K. And the number one reason they cite for leaving is that they cannot purchase a home in California. So after we deal with homelessness By that, I mean dealing with the underlying reason why people are on the streets, largely because of drug abuse and mental illness. They need to be treated. And then where are you going to put them? If you don't have low-cost housing, we have nowhere to put them. I spoke with Ben Carson, the former HUD secretary, who told me that at the end of the administration, he had struck a deal with Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, to use large parcels of federal land to build low-cost housing that wouldn't be subjected to some of the environmental rules and regulations of the state of California, and then people would have somewhere to go. I also believe we ought to get churches involved. Government doesn't know how to solve this, but religious organizations have done a far better job of spiritually motivating people to get up off the streets, to make them become far more self-sufficient. And I would urge the money to go to churches, and I don't mean government money because they come with strings, but I believe donations to churches, organizations, they can adopt a street, adopt a block, adopt a neighborhood, and we can solve this problem over time.
Do you think that churches should be asked to, or prevailed upon to give some of their property to as sites for homeless housing?
I think many churches would like to do that. I think many churches would like to get involved in this problem, but I believe that government makes it worse. There's a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, written by a guy named Marvin Olasky some years ago. And he talked about the Great Depression and how many families were eligible for aid, obviously, and many were eligible for aid but didn't take it. Fast forward, the ones that didn't take it ended up being far more self-sufficient, being far more prosperous than those that took the aid. Many of us in high school read a book called Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. This is a Frenchman who came to America, this brand new country, which was around 60, 70 years old. And he was amazed at all these, quote, mutual aid societies that were set up, not government, to help people who were homeless, to help people who needed insurance, to help people who needed to be housed. And he was struck by the charitable spirit of America. We are the most generous nation on the face of the earth. And I believe government involvement in welfare has made things worse. During the Great Depression, charitable giving skyrocketed. When FDR launched the so-called New Deal program, charitable giving still went up, but not nearly as sharply as it did before. People felt that they gave at the office. Years ago, I volunteered for the United Way. May I finish, please? And I was struck by how much of the money that was donated got down to the intended beneficiary. The private sector, nonprofit, religious organizations are far more effective and can do things far more cheaply than can government. So this problem needs to be tackled by them holistically with all the things I just now mentioned.
Carla, did you have a follow-up on housing or homelessness?
Just one more. Do you believe you understand what Housing First is, and do you believe in it?
No, I don't. I believe Housing First is a bad policy. Building homes, especially far more expensively than the private sector could build them, doesn't do anything unless you deal with the reasons why people are on the streets in the first place. Until those reasons are dealt with, building housing, you can't force them to go, you can't force them to stay. And frankly, I think it encourages other people from cold weather climates to come to California, benefit from our care and compassion, which everybody is entitled to. I can come to California, the weather's warm, I can get free needles and possibly get a free house. And cops tell me that a lot of people who are on the streets here in California aren't even from the state, but they've been encouraged there by our policies that encourage this kind of behavior.
Thank you.
I also want to note that we all have read our Tocqueville and our Charles Murray, so we're familiar with the arguments. We do want to focus on California in 2021. I do have to note that Tocqueville also did note the paradox that in the 1830s, there was a lot of equality of condition and spirit among white men. He also pointed out and acknowledged that a fifth of the people in this nation were held in bondage at the time.
All right, well, as long as you're going to do that, then have you read the other book that he wrote called Memoirs on Pauperism?
No, but I read his observations on the French Revolution.
No, so you didn't read Memoirs on Pauperism since you brought it up. That's the book that came out around the same time that Democracy in America came out. And he talked about how he had an experience 2 years before he visited America, but he didn't write it until after he visited America. And he noticed that in countries in Europe, the country that had the greatest number of beggars was the UK, even though it was by far the wealthiest nation on the face of the earth. UK turned out to have been one of the first nations, if not the first nation, to have no questions asked government welfare. The more poor countries did not have beggars. And he thought that there was a connection between government welfare and dependency. He said he didn't know the answer, but he did know that you cannot help people to the point where they become dependent. The idea is to get them to become self-sufficient, and government did a bad job of doing that. Notice Tocqueville.
I'll check out Memoir on Pauperism.
Please do.
Carrie Kavanaugh has a question on housing policy.
Yeah, so you started out by talking about making it harder for people to sue or to wipe out some of those lawsuits. I'm assuming you're talking about CEQA.
I am.
So, I mean, those are often brought by neighbors, people in the community who do not want homeless housing or affordable housing in their community. Do they have a right to try and stop housing, or is it simply they take it, how affordable housing, homeless housing goes where it goes?
Well, I believe that government is best when it's done locally. And I believe that people have every right to make their voices heard about what they want and what they don't want in their neighborhoods. I'm talking about things like this. About 15 years ago or so, there was a project, a big housing project that was on the boards in Ventura County called Amundsen Ranch. The local authorities voted for it. 9,000 housing units were planned. And of course, they were sued. But the lawsuits were failing until Rob Reiner got involved, brought his clout and his prestige, and the project was stopped. About 10 years after the project was stopped, they had a big anniversary, and they were all high-fiving each other about how wonderful it was that this land was pristine. And it was pristine, and it still is pristine. Unless Rob Reiner lives on a houseboat, wherever he lives at one time was pristine as well. There are costs and there are benefits. Not one word was written in any of the articles about this 10-year anniversary, about the 9,000 housing units that were no longer there, and about the people that otherwise would have been in those 9,000 housing units. How many other developers were deterred from even thinking about doing projects because of the success of that project being stopped, even though the local authorities approved it?
Well, the developer was
My point is, under CEQA, all sorts of development projects never get off the board because people simply have determined that anytime at all you disturb any kind of land, it's going to have an adverse environmental impact. And that's one of the reasons why we have a housing shortage here in California.
So when you talk about local control, I mean, local control is often the barrier to building housing. As governor, would you restrain local control? To what extent would you hinder a community's ability to say no to housing?
Well, isn't it interesting how the stadium for the Seattle Kings up in Seattle, all of a sudden, CEQA wasn't too much of a problem for a billionaire. Again, there are costs and there are benefits. The reason that people are leaving California, the number one reason that is cited is they can't get a house. That's the primary reason. I believe all sorts of projects are stopped, not because of anything other than environmentalists who believe that no land should be disturbed. The land that I mentioned in Amundsen is pristine land. The land where Rob Reiner probably lives was also probably pristine. There are benefits and costs. We need to weigh those, and we need to think about middle class and lower class people who cannot buy homes.
But again, just as governor, to what extent would you use your authority or your bully pulpit to restrict the ability of communities to say no to housing? What tools would you leverage?
I can declare a statewide emergency on homelessness. There are lots of projects that developers tell me are right on the boards, all ready to go, but environmentalists, many of whom do not even live in the neighborhood, are stopping these projects. I think we got to take a look at how many projects we can unleash so that we can have far more affordable housing here in California. As I said earlier, 50% of the price of a home in California is due to these environmental regulations, many of which, in my opinion, are silly regulations that are put on by people who just don't believe that any kind of new development is a good idea.
Now, if you're governor, there's a chance two really big bills might come to you. One would make it by right to build duplexes on single-family houses, on zones, and also another one that would allow up to 10 units on single-family zones. By right, no CEQA, no nothing. Would you sign those?
One more time, I believe that local control is better than statewide control, and so I would allow people to make their voices heard.
But if communities refuse to do by right development?
Well, again, when we're talking about pristine land like in Amundsen Ranch, and the local authorities approve it, I don't understand why it is that people who belong to the Sierra Club can file a lawsuit and stop a project to stop people from getting low-cost housing. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
But this is about decision makers approving housing.
Pardon me?
This is about local governments approving housing. Taking the lawsuits out of it, this is about the decision of a local city council and a board of supervisors to whether they can stop a housing development or not.
Well, why was the project in Sacramento, the Sacramento Kings building, all of a sudden built, even though there were also local people that were complaining as well? It seems to me that when certain people have enough power and authority to build things, they get built. When other people who are regular developers, regular contractors, have all sorts of projects on the boards, those are stopped. I think that's unfair. I think we need to take into consideration costs and benefits, and we're not doing that here.
Thank you.
Back to Marielle Garza.
Hi, Mr. Elder. Thanks so much for joining us. I wanted to know if you were to become, if Gavin Newsom is recalled and you are elected his replacement, would you urge Californians who haven't done so to get vaccinated against COVID-19?
I've been vaccinated. I'm nearly 70 years old. I have comorbidities. I believe vaccines work. And I would encourage people to get vaccinated. I would not make it a mandate. I think this is America, and I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, do not want to be vaccinated, either because they don't feel the vaccine have been thoroughly tested, because they feel it was approved on an emergency basis, because they don't trust Donald Trump, as Kamala Harris and Joe Biden both said. Also, some people feel that they've already had the coronavirus, they have antibodies, and some people just feel like they don't want to be pushed around. I think that people who have been vaccinated are protected from the coronavirus and from the Delta variant, from what I can tell. And I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense, as this governor has done, to mandate that state workers be vaccinated, be tested once a week, and wear a mask at work. If you are somebody who's not been vaccinated, you have assumed the risk of contracting the coronavirus. It seems to me it doesn't make any sense for them, people that have assumed the risk of contracting coronavirus, to wear a mask to protect themselves against getting or giving the coronavirus to other people who've assumed the risk. So I would not have state mandates for masks or for vaccinations.
So you support the freedom of people to get vaccinated or not. Do you think there should be any restrictions on the movement of people who are unvaccinated to gather with other people in public areas, or should they be able to do whatever they like?
I believe in freedom. I believe that if private businesses wish to have some sort of rules and regulations regarding the people who work there, regarding the customers, they can do that. But would I have some sort of statewide mandate for masks for people outdoors? No, I wouldn't.
Do you believe that the state should mandate any types of vaccines? I'm not talking about the COVID one, any types, including the childhood course of MMRs for kids entering elementary school?
No, I don't.
Why is that?
I don't believe that the state should tell a parent whether or not a child should be vaccinated. I think that's an intrusion of state power. And Thomas Jefferson warned about trading freedom for public safety, and I think he was right.
Well, they're offering them a choice. You can get vaccinated and go to public school, or you cannot and go somewhere else.
That's right.
Do you not support a choice like that?
If a parent does not want a child to be vaccinated, I don't believe that the parent should be forced to vaccinate the child.
Well, I mean, we're not. The state is mandates only if you opt to go to public school.
Correct.
And is that okay?
It's okay with me.
Okay, all right, good. And just since we're on the top of the pandemic, you had taken issue with some of the policies that the governor had taken over the course of the pandemic. And I wondered if you would identify for them specifically what things you think that he did wrong, and also what you think he should have done or what you would have done if you were governor at the time.
I think that he went along with the teachers union, and they're the largest funder of his campaign. They did not want in-school learning, even after the CDC said with certain precautions, in-school learning could resume. As I mentioned before, California, before the pandemic, 75% of Black kids cannot read at state levels of proficiency. Nearly half of third graders cannot. This is before the pandemic, and the public school students lost a whole year of in-school learning, so they're behind even more. I think that was absolutely outrageous. And one of the demands made by the largest public teachers union, the one here in Los Angeles, the United Teachers, UTLA, they demanded, in order for them to go back, that we defund the police, and they demanded single payer. To me, this is absolutely, completely, totally outrageous. Inner city parents want choice in school. Black and brown parents, the polls show, overwhelmingly want choice in school. Gavin Newsom is opposed to that. Listen to the teachers union. And as a result, I think the 80% or so of the public school students who are Black and brown have been disproportionately hurt. I would not have mandated that businesses be shut down. I think businesses should have been able to determine whether or not they want to have certain kinds of procedures, and their customers should have been able to determine whether or not they want to enter those businesses under certain kinds of procedures. I would not have forced the state down in the most draconian way compared to all of the other 49 states, the way Gavin Newsom did.
So you would have allowed bars to stay open throughout the pandemic, bars and gyms and all the non-essential business?
Yes, I would have.
Okay.
And I don't understand how come a church was shut down, but marijuana facilities were deemed to be apparently essential enough, so they were able to stay open. There are all sorts of inconsistencies that really I thought were unfair to Californians. A third of all small businesses are now shuttered forever because the way this man shut down the entire state. I think that's unfair to the hopes and dreams of people who started businesses. It's hard to run a business, let alone a successful one, let alone a profitable one. And he dashed a good 1/3 of all small businesses now closed forever. I thought that was unfair.
Okay, thank you.
Robert Green is our lead writer on criminal justice policy and policing, and has some questions.
Hi, thanks for being with us. You mentioned, you talked about crime, the situation crime in California, and I'm interested in your observation on whether the crime situation in California is worse than the rest of the nation or the same as, and if it's worse, why is that? And in what way is it worse?
Well, crime has been up in lots of cities. It's up in Chicago, it's up in New York, it's up in Los Angeles. I think one of the primary reasons for this is this false narrative that the police are engaging in systemic racism and cops are pulling back. The former commissioner of New York, Ray Kelly, says that only 7% of cops say that they would recommend the job to a family member or to a friend, largely because of this notion that the police are engaging in systemic racism. I also think that in places like Los Angeles and in Oakland, the defund the police movement has diverted funds from the police that otherwise would have been used to fight crime. I also think the release of 20,000 convicted felons, early release here in California, also added to our crime problem because statistically, many of them are likely to reoffend. I think we have soft on crime DAs. I think we have the idea of cashless bail in California. You put all that together and crime has gone up.
I'm sorry, I wasn't asking you to repeat yourself, and I apologize if it sounds like I was. You had said those things, but regarding police pulling back, what is the reason that police are pulling back? Is it because they have low morale because they're being criticized, or is it specifically because they are worried about being brought up on inappropriate charges if they do something in the course of their duty?
It's because of low morale, because of this false narrative that the police are engaging in systemic racism. I don't believe they're engaging in systemic racism. I don't believe that the police are using deadly force against Black people just because they're Black. I think the studies show just the opposite. If anything, the police are more hesitant, more reluctant to pull the trigger on a Black suspect than a white suspect. However, the false narrative is causing them to engage in passive policing so that they're just responding to radio calls. I mentioned earlier, the former mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, said that the Chicago police, when he was mayor, had, quote, gone fetal, close quote, and he was complaining that they weren't getting out, engaging in proactive policing. Bad guys know it, crime goes up, and the people that are disproportionately affected by that are the very Black and brown people that people on the left claim they care about.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of a poor performance on the part of police if they're being criticized to stop doing their jobs?
They're human beings. If you're a cop and you are put yourself at risk, and the greater risk is that if something goes wrong as perceived by community activists, why wouldn't you pull back? Why wouldn't you just respond to radio calls? And that's what's happening all over the country. Police are engaging, as I said, in passive policing.
Well, I guess the answer to your question, why wouldn't you pull back, is that it's your sworn duty not to.
I said before, police officers are human beings. Look at the number of instances in which police get out of the car, because much of policing is discretionary. In fact, most of policing is discretionary. And if you're going to be falsely accused of engaging in systemic racism, you're going to pull back and simply answer wire calls. And that's what's happening all over the country. The bad guys know it, crime goes up. And again, the very people that are hurt the most are the very Black and brown people that people on the left care about.
You spoke about defunding in Oakland and in Los Angeles. I can't speak to Oakland, but in Los Angeles, the police budget went up this year, right? I mean, there was an announcement about a $150 million cut, but in fact, the police budget went up.
Well, maybe the police budget should be even higher.
Okay. But I mean, do you observe defunding of police in Los Angeles, or are you concerned just about the rhetoric of defunding in Los Angeles?
Well, it's both. My understanding is $150 million were taken out of the police budget and moved for so-called youth programs. That 150 bucks should have stayed in the police budget and used to hire more police officers.
Okay. You mentioned the study, famous study about police being less likely to pull the trigger when they've stopped Black men. Familiar with that study, we wrote about it at the time. Didn't it also say that police are more likely to stop and arrest Black people in the first place, so that even if the study's conclusions are correct, that they're less likely to kill, they're more likely to stop, so that there still really is a racial element in policing?
I disagree strongly. In Ferguson, the DOJ did a study and they found out that Ferguson was 67% Black, but 85% of the police stops were Black. There was a gap of, what's that, 18 points or so. And the Ferguson Police Department is almost all white. In New York, roughly 25% or so of the population is Black, but about 55% of the police stops are Black. That's about a 30-point gap, even though the NYPD is racially diverse. Most of the officers are people of color. My point is, it's about behavior. During the Obama administration, there was a study about race and traffic stops that came out, I believe, in 2013, and it found out that Black motorists were more likely to commit offenses, more likely to drive too fast, more likely to drive without a license, more likely to drive with an expired tag, more likely to drive without a seatbelt, more likely to drive without a car seat for a child in the back. And so the differences in the number of people that were stopped had to do with differences in level of offending. For several years in places like LA and San Francisco, I think now virtually almost every major police department, officers have to write down the race of the people that they stop. If in fact that there was a pattern of stopping people just because they're Black, I would expect to see all sorts of class action lawsuits filed by various lawyers arguing that the police departments are engaging in racial profiling. I don't see the lawsuits because they're not engaging in racial profiling. They're responding to behavior. Years ago, there was a study in New Jersey. The New Jersey troopers were accused of stopping people on the New Jersey Turnpike just because they were Black. Christy Todd Whitman, the liberal governor, ordered a study. The study came back and found out that the police were not stopping people disproportionately on the Turnpike because Black people were disproportionately driving fast. And the faster the speed, the more likely the driver was to be Black. She didn't like the study, threw it out, hired a different person, a different group with different methodology. They came up with exactly the same conclusions. You have to look at people's behavior. If you don't have a sensible and fair discussion about high levels of offending and just look at the numbers, you're not being fair to the officers.
You mentioned the prisoners released on compassionate release because of COVID. I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that you would reverse that.
I sure would.
And you referred to other prison releases as well. If you had the power as governor, I'm assuming you would reverse that?
I would.
What else would you do as governor to address the crime situation, apart from rhetoric about policing and apart from release of inmates? Is there anything else that you would do as governor to address the crime situation?
I also would defend the police. As I mentioned before, 81% of Black people want the police manpower to remain the same or to be higher. I would recommend that we hire even more police officers. But I think the primary thing is to change the rhetoric, change the idea that the police are engaging in systemic racism. I just read that there are 1,000 fewer cops in Chicago because police officers are retiring early, or because people are not signing up to be police officers because of this narrative that if you become an officer, you wear a badge, all of a sudden you're a Nazi. And I think these kinds of things are hurting the very people in the inner city who disproportionately need to have the police. I mentioned Tupac Shakur. The gentleman didn't like it, but one of the things Tupac Shakur said is that we need the police more than anybody else because we're living in the criminal element closer than other people are living at. So for all those reasons, I believe that the police need to be rhetorically supported. They need to be funded. We need to stop this defund the police movement and stop this lie that the police are engaging in systemic racism and that they're targeting Black people just because they're Black. I believe the data refutes that.
Do you believe that Derek Chauvin was treated fairly and justly in his proceedings in Minneapolis?
I'm fine with the verdict. I have no idea what this has to do with why I want to be governor of California, but I'm fine with the verdict.
Well, it has to do with the rhetoric around policing and the degree to which it's rhetoric and the degree to which there's actually a racial element. That's the reason I asked the question.
Fair enough.
Mr. Elder, have you, if I can, have you, if you don't mind my asking a personal question, have you as an African-American man ever been stopped by the police?
Wow. As you as an Asian man, have you ever been stopped by the police?
I haven't actually, and I think one reason I haven't is that
You've never been stopped by the police in your life?
I actually haven't, and that's why I'm asking bona fide. I think if I were black, I would be stopped more often. I really do.
Well, the answer is I don't know anybody who hasn't been stopped by the police. You're the only one I think I know of in my life who's ever said he's never been stopped by the police. I don't know. Maybe you have a halo around you or something. Everybody I know has been stopped by the police. I have been stopped by the police many, many, many times, especially when I first got my driver's license. I looked young. I had a growth spurt, but at the time when I was driving, my eye level was so low, I looked like a child. And for the first year, I was stopped probably by the police, I would say, and I'm not exaggerating this, between 75 and 100 times. And every time I did what my father told me to do, which was to make sure my left hand was at 10 o'clock, my right hand was at 2 o'clock, make sure I said yes, sir, or no, sir, make sure my paperwork was in order, and nothing happened to me. I was arrested one time when I was worked as a certified law clerk with the DA's office. I was in Hollywood. I was walking across the street, and a couple of police officers told me that I was walking against a blinking sign, and in my opinion, I wasn't. Officer asked me for ID. I told him this wasn't the Soviet Union. I didn't have to have ID, and I was referred to as a smartass, and I was taken to jail. I thought it was unfair. I filed a complaint. The complaint went nowhere, but I did escalate it by mouthing off to the officer. I could have been more polite, and the officer could have been more polite. The whole thing could have been avoided. I think if both of us had changed our behavior a little bit. May I also mention something else? There's a town called Rialto here in California. It's about 100,000 people. And the officers were ordered to wear body cams. Some had body cams that were active. Some had body cams that were not. They didn't know which ones were which. But officers were ordered to wear body cams, and the public knew about the body cams. Police complaints fell 90%, and police use of force fell 50%. In my opinion, the fall of the police use of force had to do with the fact that the civilians were behaving differently. It is a crime to make a false allegation against a police officer. And when the civilians were aware they were recording, all of a sudden, they stopped making allegations against the police. I think a lot of allegations against the police are lies that are made by civilians. And when they realized they were being recorded, those lies stopped, and the police did not, and their behavior improved, and the police did not have to use the same kind of force that they had to use before.
I have to ask, you really struck me when you said that you were stopped 75 to 100 times. Do you think that's normal? I don't know anybody,
Well,
half my family is Latino who has gotten stopped that much as a teenager.
I'm not lying. I
totally believe you. But the point being is, do you think it's normal for a young man to be stopped that many times? And if you don't think that race is at play, what did you think is at play?
I looked young. That's what the officer said over and over and over again. I looked young, and I did look young. They were polite. Once I showed them the license, issue was over. I wasn't beaten. I wasn't tased. I wasn't thrown against the wall. I was treated politely because I responded politely. And that's one of the problems. I think some of these so-called civil rights leaders and so-called people who are activists should tell people, be polite, comply. Jacob Blake could have been avoided had he complied. Eric Garner could have been avoided had he complied. Michael Brown could have been avoided had he complied. Most of these high-profile shootings and deaths could have been avoided if the person stopped simply had complied. I would urge people to comply. There's a famous video that I shouldn't say famous, a video that I did a little while ago where a Maricopa County activist in Arizona who was anti-cop was given an opportunity to have a shoot-no-shoot drill by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department, and he did it to his credit. And at the end of the session, he realized the importance of complying. And officers have a very dangerous job. They have to make split decisions in a very short period of time and a very dangerous situation. And he then began saying, I needed to emphasize compliance more often than I had, much to his credit.
We're listening. Thank you. Carrie Kavanaugh has a question about climate change and environment.
Yeah, you've said recently that you believe in climate change. You believe that humans are having an effect on it. How would you as governor structure the state's response to climate change?
Well, I wouldn't. I think that the idea that we can do anything at all about the climate at the California level is pretty silly. I think that we ought to be encouraging more fracking. I think there's been a war on oil and gas in California in the last 10 years, last several years. Almost all of the top oil and gas companies have left. We used to have, I think, all 10 of them headquartered here. I think now the only one left is Chevron. I believe that also for those who are climate change alarmists, and I'm not one of them, one of the ways to minimize CO2 emissions is nuclear power. We closed San Onofre a little while ago. Diablo is the only one now still operating, and that's supposed to be decommissioned in a few years. I would encourage the construction of more nuclear power plants. Japan and France get the bulk of their power from nuclear, and nuclear technology has improved so that the idea that it'll be like 3 Mile Island, and by the way, nobody died at 3 Mile Island, is not true. I think we ought to be encouraging nuclear power plants.
But aside from nuclear power, are there any policies that you would want the state to pursue in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
No, not really. I would want more fracking, not less, because again, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between energy that we don't have to import from other states and jobs for the middle class. And I believe that a lot of jobs have been lost because of this, in my opinion, unfair attack against the oil and gas industry. We have a lot of oil and gas. We have a lot of fracking. We have a lot of natural gas in California. We ought to be encouraging it.
You know, in poll after poll, Californians support the state's climate program and attempts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the state. Are you out of step with the majority of Californians on that?
I think the majority of Californians have no idea that even if we did every single thing that Gavin Newsom wants, I believe he has an executive order for us to be carbon neutral by 2020 or 2030, 2035, whatever it is, will have virtually no effect at all on the climate in the world. And I think if more people knew that and more people were aware of the trade-offs that we're having, and more people were aware of the benefits of nuclear, I think the attitude would change. I think the dynamic would change. I think a lot of people haven't heard what I had to say about the climate. There is also a documentary that was produced by Michael Moore, I don't know if you saw it, called Planet of the Humans, in which he attacks the idea that we can force feed go from a fossil fuel-based economy to a wind and solar-based economy and have it cost-effective. He trashed the whole idea and even attacked Al Gore, whom he claimed got wealthy by pushing this phony narrative. His solutions were not the solutions I would have, but even this documentary produced by Michael Moore shed a lot of negativity on the idea that we have the technology and it would be cost beneficial to move from a fossil-based energy economy to a so-called renewable-based one. By the way, even YouTube shut down that documentary because the conclusions offended YouTube. I think it's back up there now, but for a while they took it down.
But if the state is feeling so much of the effect, I mean, I guess when we have wildfires that you've acknowledged have an effect from climate change, deadly heat waves, sea level rise, I mean, the state is feeling the impacts of climate change. Why do we therefore not have a responsibility as a state to do our part in addressing global climate change, especially when the state is a technology leader?
I think we ought to deal with the effects of climate change and not try and force feed our energy system to go from fossil fuels to a wind and solar-based economy. Also regarding the effect of climate change on the drought, on the fires, there is an effect. We don't know what the effect is, but I think the biggest reason we're having these problems is because of the failure to clear fallen trees and dry vegetation. Jerry Brown left a plan for 500,000 acres of fallen trees and dry vegetation to be cleared, and it doesn't appear that there's been even a dent in that plan. I would activate that. We would minimize the damage done by some of these from these fires. But also part of it is something that you can't do a whole lot about. As long as we're building more and more homes in fire-prone areas, largely because they're cheaper, we're going to have these kinds of problems. And these fires are started by human activity, and we're not going to eliminate human activity. But we can do something about the severity of the fires by clearing away the fallen trees and by not having the war on logging that we had in this state. Logging used to be almost 100% bigger than it is right now. And as a result, the fallen trees are not being cleared away. When you look at the way private forests have been managed, it's far better than the state ones and the federal ones because there's a vested interest to make sure that the damage is less severe.
Actually, you raised an interesting point on the residential development in wildfires here. Is that something you would want to restrict?
I wouldn't want to restrict it, but I would want people to be realistic about it. I also feel that the cost of living in those areas are not really borne by the homeowners, and maybe they should be. From what I can tell, the insurance does not really reflect the risk, nor does it reflect all of the taxpayer dollars being spent to put out these fires for the people that build there. Maybe we should have a much more realistic way of assessing exactly the price of building in these kinds of areas. And maybe we ought to have a more realistic way of allowing people to build closer to urban areas. Much of that construction is stopped by, as I said before, the California Environmental Quality Act that I think stops so much urban construction.
Boy, if you allow insurance rates to rise in the wildfire areas, whether it's a good idea or not, and put potentially restrictions and make it more expensive, that's going to be enormously unpopular. Are you comfortable with being a governor who takes that kind of blowback and pushes those kinds of policies that will be enormously unpopular with people in those communities?
Everything has trade-offs. Building a home in a fire-prone area, the people that build the home in the fire-prone area ought to bear the cost of it, not put the cost on other taxpayers. Somebody's paying for all the firefighters. Somebody's paying for all the helicopters. Somebody's paying for all the fixed-wing aircraft that we're using to fight these fires.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elder. Jean Guerrero is one of our op-ed columnists.
I know who she is.
And but just to be clear, she's not a member of our editorial board, but she is, of course, one of our
And why was she invited to the meeting?
In fact, so I'm going to interrupt here. We were not informed that she would be part of this call. We're not interested in her questions and her bigotry masquerading as journalism. We've taken questions from all of you. Many of you disagree with us. We don't have a problem with that. We're not interested in taking questions from Ms. Jean Guerrero.
Let me
not
finish
interested in her dishonesty, and we don't mind people who disagree with us. And you guys never told us she was going to be part of this call, so she can stay, but not ask questions.
Just to be clear, and this is just to be clear, we have invited our columnists, and there are 5 to all our meetings. Some have chosen to attend various ones, and some haven't. We've done this as a courtesy because we're one unified LA Times opinion team.
I'm not answering any questions from Jean Guerrero.
And if you are a unified opinion team, you guys should have told that in advance. We specifically asked who would attend this meeting, and Jean Guerrero's name is not on there. Again, we're not talking to her not because we disagree with her, because still, after all, you and I talk regularly. Larry would be glad to talk to you and the colleagues who's just asked questions. We're not interested in Ms. Guerrero because she's dishonest, and she's we're not interested in her bigotry.
Well, I would like to hear Jean's question, and you can choose whether or not you wish to answer.
Thank you. Hi, sir. So you've criticized California's sanctuary laws, state-funded healthcare for immigrants, and driver's licenses for immigrants.
Hang on a second. We really are not interested in hearing your question. I know, Sewell, you just said that, but it is entirely dishonest for you guys to slip this woman in without giving us advance notice. We would have told you in advance that we're not interested in hearing from her if you had told us that she was going to be part of this call.
Well, can I ask a question?
That's fine.
All right. We're all very interested in Mr. Elder's positions on immigration and the immigrant community. So in terms of when you're elected as governor, would you, you've criticized the sanctuary laws, what would you do about those?
I would reverse the sanctuary laws. This has become a sanctuary state. I'm opposed to illegal immigration. I support legal immigration. I think illegal immigration is wrong. I think many of the illegal aliens in our country are disproportionately unskilled. They compete for jobs against unskilled Black and brown workers living in the inner city and put downward pressure on their wages. I would discourage illegal immigration, and I would encourage us to discontinue sanctuary state policies.
What about things like driver's licenses?
If I had the ability when this was being considered, I would have been against it. I think any kind of putting a green welcome mat to illegal aliens is wrong. We ought not be encouraging illegal immigration. We should be encouraging legal immigration. I also think it's wrong that we have in-state tuition for illegal aliens in California when somebody living in Arizona who's born and raised here, if he gets into UCLA, cannot get in-state tuition. I think it's unfair.
What would you do with the DACA folks?
Pardon me?
What would you do with the DACA folks, the Dreamers?
I think that I would allow people to have a pathway to stay, but not to become citizens. I think that rewarding illegal entry and ultimately giving people citizenship is going to encourage more illegal entry.
Wouldn't that open the way, though, to a permanent second-class citizenship, which the 14th Amendment does not permit?
In your opinion, I don't think it does. I think being generous enough to allow people who are in the country illegally to remain here without deportation, to me, is sufficiently humane.
And to be clear, sorry, go ahead.
Two more small questions on immigration. One is, would you target, kind of healthcare for undocumented people? Would you close that down?
I don't believe that illegal aliens should get health care. No, I don't.
And then would you increase or reverse cooperation with the federal authorities, federal immigration authorities, and local police here in California?
I believe that we ought not be a sanctuary state, so that violent illegal aliens should be turned over to the feds and should be deported.
So you would go back to the Safe Communities program?
I would.
Yeah, just to be clear, though, right? I mean, undocumented immigrants who commit crimes are already violent crimes are already deported, and that's beyond.
Are they? Are they turned over to the authorities and deported, or have we cut back on that?
Fair point. I think the ones who come to the attention of the federal authorities are deported, but I hear what you're saying.
And by the way, I think one of the problems is you use terms like undocumented. There's no term like undocumented in our legal code, in the U.S. code. The term is illegal alien, not undocumented. These are kinds of terms that, in my opinion, soften the attitude towards illegal aliens and minimize the harm that illegal aliens do to our country. There's an economist named George Borjas from Harvard. He's probably done more work on the impact of legal and illegal immigration than anybody else. And he says there are winners and losers. The winners are people who hire illegal aliens, pay them less money. The losers are people who are Black and brown workers, often unskilled, living in the inner city, who have to compete for jobs and who also endure downward pressure on their wages because of the existence of illegal alien labor.
Yeah, we've read that. Borjas appears to be very unusual in finding this.
Well, I didn't think you were going to agree. You don't have to tell me that. You don't have to tell me that you don't agree. I know you don't agree with almost anything.
But we have read. And that's just what I want to point out.
You know, all of you have read it.
Yeah.
Would you sign it? Do you sign it to all the people here that I'm talking to? Every single person knows who George Borjas is? I doubt it.
Yeah, we do.
Well, Terry and I do. I don't know. Again, yeah.
We can raise our hands.
What's interesting, everybody's read de Tocqueville. Everybody's read George Borjas.
No, I hadn't read Memoir on Pauperism. I took notes, man.
We're running out of time, and I think we need to ask a couple more questions while we still have you. But first, I need to say, you're right. I, as the person who set up this meeting, I didn't give you Jean Guerrero's name. She is one of our staff members. She's one of our opinion staff members.
Yeah, I know she is.
Harry's. I know. I'm just telling you that I'm the person if you want to be mad at anybody. But I have to ask you. I haven't asked my question yet. If you are unwilling to engage in a single person who has been critical of you, how can we expect that you could be a governor of a state in which, there are bound to be thousands, if not millions, of people who don't agree with you, who will be critical of your policies, or already are critical of your policies? Are you simply not going to engage with people who do not agree with you?
Because I'm unwilling to engage in somebody who's all called me a Black David Duke when I wasn't told she's going to be on the editorial board. Therefore, I'm not going to engage in people who disagree with me. That's pretty foolish. That doesn't follow.
Mr. Elder, let me ask a couple of basic questions. Who won the last presidential election?
Joe Biden is the occupant in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and Donald Trump is in Florida. Who won the 2016 election?
Donald Trump.
Hillary doesn't think so. She called the election stolen. She referred to him as illegitimate for the entirety of his career. She also has convinced 2/3 of Democrats to believe that the 2016 election involved the Russians changing vote tallies, even though the 1,000-page, let me please finish. Even though the 1,000-page Senate report found no evidence whatsoever, despite Russia's efforts, they changed a single vote tally, yet 2/3 of Democrats believe the Russians changed vote tallies in the 2016 election. Also, the Intel report found no evidence.
I don't believe that. Okay, yeah.
I hope you don't believe that. I'm telling you, you don't believe that 2/3 of Democrats believe that?
Oh, no, that part. I don't know if that's true, but I certainly don't believe any Russian vote ballot. I think Hillary Clinton had a massive, colossal failure to reach out to white women.
A YouGov poll found 66% of Democrats believe falsely that the Russians changed vote tallies. 78%, according to Gallup, of Democrats believe that the Russians altered the outcome of the election, even though the Senate report could not find one way or another whether or not they had done so. My point is Hillary's assertion that Donald Trump stole the election and that Donald Trump is illegitimate, that she said for 4 years, has caused Democrats to falsely believe those two things. Yet Hillary's social media was never shut down. Nobody ever called her a purveyor of the big lie. And that's a double standard that I believe that the left has pushed down the throats of the American people, and it is unfair. Do I believe that there were shenanigans in the 2020 election? Absolutely, I do. I believe that the Pennsylvania deadline was extended and that Alan Dershowitz and Jonathan Turley, two left-wing lawyers, believed that the Supreme Court should have taken up the Pennsylvania case on the merits. They chose not to, but they felt they should have taken it up. And they also felt that had they taken it up, the Donald Trump lawsuit would have prevailed. I also believe the Hunter Biden story was suppressed. I know it was suppressed. The CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, all but apologized for suppressing that story that was done by the New York Post. Enough Biden voters said that had they known about the story, they would not have voted for Biden. It would have changed the election. Wisconsin, 4-3, the Supreme Court ruled not to take up the case on the merits. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Wisconsin, filed a very strong dissent, arguing that the case should have been taken up on the merits, and it wasn't. So for all those reasons, I believe there were shenanigans in the 2020 election, but Joe Biden is the president and Donald Trump is sitting right now in Florida somewhere.
Understood. Mr. Elder, what should be done about the
And
social
I'm sorry, so.
Can you
it's
please,
1 o'clock,
what should
it's
be
1
done
o'clock.
about the social media giants? They are an issue that you just raised that I actually think have caused concern among a whole array of Americans. Maybe one of the few things that causes concern across a whole array of Americans, regardless of their political views, is the power that these platforms have aggregated in our society and our economy. In your view, what's the right approach?
You know what, out of respect for you, so if we could ask.
That can be the
make
last.
that the last question.
Sure.
We do need to keep Larry going as.
Understood. And we're,
But I understand you want to get that question in, so.
I do, because it was just raised.
Yes,
And
of course. Thank you.
please go ahead, and thank you for your time.
I don't believe they should be broken up. I believe that the answer is more competition, and I believe that's happening. I believe more conservatives should set up their own social platforms to address the clear bias that these big techs have shown. I think Twitter is biased. I think Facebook is biased. I think Google is biased. I think all of them have suppressed stories or manipulated algorithms to advance a left-wing agenda. But the answer is not for more government regulation. The answer is for more competition.
Thanks for your time, and thanks for this hour. We really appreciate your time.